05:25 in the morning, May 26, 1941. Somewhere over the North Atlantic, a lone flying boat drones through broken cloud at 3,000 feet. Below, nothing but grey water and grey sky, stitched together by rain. Inside the cockpit, a farm boy from Missouri sits at the controls of a British aircraft. He is flying combat for a country that is not yet at war. He is not supposed to be here. His name will not appear in any newspaper for years, and the medal he is about to earn cannot even be announced. Somewhere out there, hidden by weather and desperation, runs the most dangerous warship on the planet. In a few minutes, this young American, in this slow, ungainly, unglamorous machine, is going to be the one who finds it. They dismissed the aircraft as a flying truck. Underpowered, they said. Slow. A patrol plane, not a hunter. And yet, in the space of one morning, an American at the controls of this awkward machine will hand the British fleet the exact position of the German battleship Bismarck. He will set in motion the final hours of the most feared ship in the German Navy, and for years, his own government will not be able to admit he was there at all. This is the story of the American who found the Bismarck and the secret that had to be buried to protect him. His name was Leonard Smith, Ensign Leonard Smith, United States Navy, a grocer's son from Mayview, Missouri, raised on a farm, who earned his Navy wings at Pensacola and then volunteered for something the history books would keep quiet for decades. To understand how a Missouri farm boy ended up over the North Atlantic months before Pearl Harbor, you have to understand the trap the British had just walked into. By late May of 1941, the Royal Navy had a catastrophe on its hands. 2 days earlier, the Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen had annihilated the battle cruiser Hood in the Battle of the Denmark Strait. A single German shell reached the Hood's magazines, and she blew apart and sank in about 3 minutes. Only 3 men survived out of a crew of roughly 1,400. It was the worst single loss the Royal Navy had suffered in living memory. Then the Bismarck vanished. She had slipped her pursuers in the fog and the dark. Now the entire British war machine was hunting a ghost. Every available cruiser, destroyer, and battleship had been pulled into the search. Fuel was running low on the shadowing warships. Time was running out. If Bismarck reached the cover of German air bases at Brest, on the coast of occupied France, she would be almost untouchable. She would sit safe under a German air umbrella, free to sail out again and again to savage the Atlantic convoys that were Britain's lifeline. And those convoys were carrying American supplies. This was already quietly an American problem too. To understand why one flying boat mattered so much, you have to understand just how blind the search really was in that stretch of ocean. Radar of the era existed, but it was primitive, short-ranged, and unreliable over open water. It could tell you something was out there. It could rarely tell you what or exactly where, especially in weather like this. Long-range naval reconnaissance in 1941 came down to one thing, and one thing only: eyes. A human being in an aircraft, staring at empty water for hours, hoping to see something before it saw them. Fighters did not have the range for this kind of search. Bombers did not have the fuel to loiter for hours over a search box the size of a small country. What was needed was not a hunter. It was a set of eyes that could stay in the sky nearly all day, in weather that grounded almost everything else. And the machine that could do it was American. The aircraft was the PBY Catalina, built by Consolidated Aircraft in San Diego, California. Crews just called it the Cat. Britain had ordered its first batch of about 100 of them by direct purchase, with many hundreds more to follow, shipped over under President Roosevelt's Lend-Lease program. It was not fast. Top speed was barely 175 miles per hour, slower than most fighters could manage even in a stall. It carried almost no armor. It was not built to fight, and every pilot who flew one knew it. What it was built to do was stay in the air. Consolidated's engineers had given it a high-mounted parasol wing, perched above the fuselage on a single central pylon with minimal external bracing. That clean design cut drag dramatically compared to older flying boats, which were a tangle of struts and wires fighting the air at every angle. And it carried an enormous fuel load. On this mission, Smith's aircraft carried a full capacity load of 1,750 gallons of fuel, enough to keep her airborne for well over 20 hours at a stretch. Think about what that actually means. Nearly a full day in the air, alone, over open ocean, with no support, no backup, and no rescue if something went wrong. If the engines failed out there was no diverting to a nearby field. There was only grey water in every direction. But the British had a second problem, and this is where America comes in through the back door. The Catalina was brand new to them. Their crews barely knew how to fly it. So a quiet call went out for American pilots to come to Britain, teach the Royal Air Force how to handle these machines, and check the crews out on the new aircraft. The first Catalinas arrived early in 1941, and a small group of United States Navy pilots came with them. One of them was Ensign Leonard Smith. Now here is the part that had to stay buried. The United States was still officially neutral in 1941. These American pilots were supposed to be instructors, observers, advisors. Instead, they were quietly being put in the cockpit on real combat patrols, flying operational missions against a country the United States was not at war with. If word had gotten out, it would have been a political bomb back home. As one account has it, Roosevelt himself is said to have remarked that if Congress found out he had sent pilots to Britain, he would be impeached. So Smith's presence in that cockpit and what he was about to do became a closely guarded secret. For years afterward, the British would publicly credit the aircraft's British commander, Flying Officer Dennis Briggs, for the sighting, precisely because nobody could admit an American had been at the controls. The truth was different, and the truth is the story. Smith lifted off from Lough Erne in Northern Ireland in the small hours of the morning, aboard Catalina AH545 of No. 209 Squadron. The weather was brutal from the start, a ceiling that sank from 1,000 feet down to as low as 100 feet. Visibility that dropped from 5 miles all the way to nothing. Winds gusting 30 to 35 out of the northwest, cutting his ground speed to barely 80 knots. The aircraft was fighting the sky just to move forward. Hour after hour of instruments, static on the radio, and grey nothing stretching in every direction. The kind of flying that wears a crew down, long before any enemy comes into view. At 10:10 in the morning, Smith looked out and saw something that did not belong on the empty ocean below. A ship, a big one. He took control from the autopilot by hand and steered the Catalina toward a nearby cloud bank, meaning to close in and shadow her from cover without being seen. But inside the cloud, he lost his bearings, and when he swung back out into clear air, he came out almost directly over the target, looking very nearly straight down her single massive funnel. There was no mistaking her now. It was the Bismarck. The Bismarck's gunners reacted almost instantly. Anti-aircraft fire opened up, filling the sky around the slow, unarmored flying boat. Shrapnel struck the hull. This was not a fighter that could roll away at high speed and outrun the danger. This was a lumbering patrol aircraft, still carrying a full load of depth charges beneath its wings, suddenly caught in the open by one of the most heavily armed warships afloat. Smith jettisoned the depth charges to lighten the aircraft and hauled hard for the cover of cloud, jinking to throw off the gunners as he clawed for altitude. His British crewman got the contact report out over the radio. Then Smith stayed up as long as his fuel would allow, circling in and out of the murk, updating the battleship's position and speed while the flak kept reaching for him. Finally, low on fuel, he lost her in the weather and never regained contact. It did not matter. The report had already gone out. For the first time in more than a full day, the fleet finally knew exactly where its enemy was. And the man who had found her was a neutral American who, on paper, had no business being anywhere near that ocean. Now, before we go on, let me be straight with you about one thing, because the comment section will bring it up, and it deserves an honest answer. You will sometimes hear that codebreakers, not Smith, really found the Bismarck. Here is the truth. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park had intercepted a German message that suggested Bismarck was heading for Brest. That narrowed the search down from an ocean to a corner of it. But narrowing the search is not the same as finding the ship. It was Smith's Catalina, breaking out of the cloud at 10:10 that morning, that produced the actual confirmed sighting. Codebreaking told the fleet roughly where to look. An American told them exactly where she was. If stories like this, the ones history quietly buried, are the reason you keep coming back, a subscribe genuinely helps this channel dig up more of them. Now back to it. Here is where honesty makes the American role bigger, not smaller. Smith did not sink the Bismarck. He did not fire the shot that crippled her, and he was not there for the kill. What he did was find her, and finding her was the one thing nobody else in the sky that day could do. Once the position was known, the machinery of the Royal Navy did the rest. That evening, Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers from the aircraft carrier Ark Royal pressed home an attack in the fading light, and one torpedo jammed the Bismarck's rudder solid. From that moment, the most powerful battleship in the German Navy could no longer steer for home. She could only turn in slow, helpless circles while the British fleet closed in through the night. It is easy looking back to make this sound tidy. A ship spotted, a signal sent, a battle won. The reality was closer to chaos. Dozens of warships were burning fuel at a punishing rate across a search area covering hundreds of thousands of square miles of open Atlantic. Destroyers were peeling off one by one, forced to turn back toward port because they no longer had the fuel to keep searching and still make it home. Some of the heaviest ships in the fleet were running low enough that their commanders faced a real question about whether they could stay in the fight at all. Every hour without a confirmed position was an hour closer to losing the Bismarck for good. That is the pressure sitting behind Smith's sighting that morning. This was not a leisurely patrol. It was the last realistic window anyone had to find a ship that could vanish into the Atlantic and never be seen again. And an American found her. By the morning of May 27th, the Bismarck was crippled, unable to steer, and completely surrounded. The British battleships, King George V and Rodney, closed to short range and pounded her for nearly 2 hours with their main guns. The cruiser Dorsetshire finished her with torpedoes, and she went down that morning. Out of a crew of more than 2,200 men, only about 114 were pulled from the cold Atlantic alive. None of it happens on that timeline without the sighting. Not the swordfish strike that jammed her rudder. Not the converging battleships closing in through the night. The entire chain of events that ended the Bismarck traces directly back to a slow American flying boat breaking through cloud at 10:10 in the morning, with an American ensign at the controls of a British aircraft that officially had no business finding her at all. And Smith was not the only American in that sky. As the net tightened, at least one more of those loaned United States Navy pilots, Lieutenant James Johnson, in a Catalina of No. 240 Squadron, helped hold contact on the doomed battleship. Americans, flying American aircraft, quietly threaded all the way through the hunt. For his role, Leonard Smith was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. But here is the twist that tells you everything about how secret this was. His own Navy could not announce the medal. Doing so would have exposed the whole arrangement, while America was still neutral. So the award was held back, unspoken, until after the United States entered the war. Smith earned one of his country's highest flying honors for an action his country could not admit had happened. Now, a word of honesty, because accuracy is the whole point of this channel. Smith is often called the first American to play a decisive role in an Allied naval victory in the Second World War, and that is a fair claim. He is not, however, the very first American to fight in the war. American volunteers were already flying combat in the Royal Air Force Eagle squadrons, and some had already died months before this flight. What makes Smith remarkable is not that he was first into the fight. It is what he found, and the silence that had to surround it. It is worth being honest, too, about what the Catalina itself was not, because the record deserves it. It was not a warship killer. It carried no weapon capable of seriously damaging a battleship, and the mission that mattered most that day carried no special radar at all. It relied entirely on human eyes. Compare it to Imperial Japan's own long-range flying boat of the same era, the Kawanishi H-8K, which Allied crews would later nickname the Flying Porcupine for how hard it was to shoot down. The Kawanishi was faster, far better armed, and built with real combat survivability in mind, with self-sealing fuel tanks and cannon in every direction. In a straight fight between the two designs, the Japanese aircraft was, by most measures, the more dangerous machine. It also came later, and Japan built barely more than 150 of them. America built over 3,000 Catalinas, and that is the whole point. Speed and firepower were never the Catalina's argument. Its argument was endurance, range, reliability, and sheer numbers. A machine you could build by the thousand and keep in the air for nearly a full day if the mission demanded it. The Kawanishi was built to fight. The Catalina was built to watch and to refuse to stop watching. On the days when an entire war turned on somebody simply not blinking first, that difference paid off again and again. It paid off over the grey Atlantic, and it paid off barely a year later at Midway, where American Catalina crews spotted the Japanese fleet hundreds of miles out, handing the United States Navy the opening move in the battle that turned the entire Pacific War. The Cat's story did not end there either. Across the war, these same slow American aircraft found second lives nobody had designed them for. Crews in the Pacific painted their Catalinas flat black, mixing soot into the paint, and turned them into near-invisible night raiders against Japanese shipping. They became known as the Black Cats. Others flew air-sea rescue under enemy fire code-named Dumbo missions, and one Catalina pilot, Lieutenant Nathan Gordon, landed on the open ocean 4 separate times under fire off New Ireland to pull 15 downed airmen from the water, an act that earned him the Medal of Honor. Later in the war, another Catalina crew would land in the open Pacific and lash survivors of the sunken cruiser Indianapolis to their wings to keep them alive. Back over the grey Atlantic on May 26th, Ensign Leonard Smith never saw the Bismarck sink. He had turned for home hours earlier, low on fuel, his mission complete the moment that contact report left the radio. Far to the east, his few minutes over that battleship were already doing their work, setting a fleet in motion that he would never personally see arrive. Smith flew on. He served through the Second World War and Korea, went from open cockpit biplanes to supersonic jets, retired a Navy captain, and was laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery. But it is that one grey morning in 1941 that history remembers. An awkward, underpowered American flying boat, built to loiter instead of to fight, flown by a Missouri farm boy who was not supposed to be there, delivered the position of the most feared warship in the German Navy to the men who would sink her. Sometimes, the deadliest thing in the sky is not the one that pulls the trigger. It is the one and the man that simply refuses to stop looking.